The studio hallway was cold in the way television studios always seem to be. Climate controlled to protect the equipment, not the people standing in it. Somewhere beyond a heavy, soundproofed door, a stage manager's voice counted down minutes in clipped, even tones. The kind of voice that had said the same numbers so many times they no longer carried urgency, only information. It was the early 2000s, and Katt Williams stood near that door, waiting for his cue, in the final minutes before a broadcast that would put him in front of more people than almost anything he had done up to that point in his career. He wasn't alone. Cedric the Entertainer was there too, not performing that night, but present, the way established performers sometimes were on nights like this, moving through studio hallways with the easy familiarity of someone who had been in rooms like this more times than he could count. He and Katt Williams weren't strangers. They existed in overlapping circles of comedians who had, over the years, crossed paths at clubs, at industry events, at the kinds of gatherings where people who did the same difficult job for a living found themselves in the same room more often than chance alone would suggest. What happened between them in those final minutes before the broadcast wasn't part of any rehearsal, wasn't scripted by any producer, and wasn't something either man would have described afterward as a big moment. But for Katt Williams, standing in that hallway with the countdown ticking down behind the door, it was exactly the kind of moment that mattered most. Not because of what it changed, but because of when it happened. To understand why those few minutes carried the weight they did, it helps to understand what a television broadcast like this one meant for a comedian's career in the early 2000s, and what the backstage world of a TV studio actually felt like in the moments before the cameras started rolling. Television in this era still functioned as a gatekeeper in a way that would change dramatically within a decade. A single appearance, a stand-up set on a late-night show, a featured spot on a broadcast special, a performance that aired once and lived only in the memory of whoever happened to be watching that night, could shift the entire trajectory of a comedian's career. There was no replaying it later online, no clips that would circulate for years afterward. It existed in that moment, broadcast once, to however many million people happened to have their televisions on, and then it was over. That made the stakes of any single appearance enormous. A strong performance could open doors that had been closed for years. A weak one or a missed opportunity might not come again for a long time. For a comedian at Katt Williams' stage of his career in the early 2000s, an opportunity like this represented something he had been working toward for years. Small clubs, late slots, rooms that sometimes had more empty seats than full ones. All of it building toward moments like this one, where the audience on the other side of the camera was larger than any room he had ever performed in combined. The pressure of that wasn't abstract. It was physical, present in the cold air of the hallway, in the stage manager's countdown, in the particular kind of stillness that settles over a person in the minutes before they have to be funny in front of millions of strangers, with no second chances and no retakes. Television studios themselves had a specific atmosphere during this era. Long hallways lined with closed doors, each one leading to dressing rooms, green rooms, equipment storage, all of it humming with the quiet mechanical sound of air conditioning units working to keep cameras and lighting equipment from overheating. Crew members moved through these hallways with headsets and clipboards, their voices low, their pace quick but controlled. Monitors mounted near doorways showed a live feed of the studio floor, where lighting rigs and camera operators made final adjustments under a wash of bright, even light. Everything about the space was built for efficiency, for precision, for a broadcast that had to happen on schedule, down to the second. There was a particular rhythm to these hallways in the final half hour before a live broadcast, a rhythm that anyone who worked in television came to recognize without thinking about it. Earlier in the evening, the halls were busier, filled with the ordinary noise of preparation, wardrobe adjustments, sound checks, last-minute conversations between producers and talent. But as the broadcast drew closer, that noise thinned out. Doors closed, voices dropped. The crew members who remained moved with a kind of practiced quiet, aware that the people waiting behind those doors needed less noise, not more. By the time the countdown reached its final minutes, the hallway outside the studio floor often held only a handful of people: performers, a stage manager with a headset and a clipboard, and anyone else who happened to be there for reasons of their own. Somewhere within all of that controlled efficiency, performers waited, often alone, often in silence, carrying whatever nerves they had brought with them into a building that didn't have much room for nerves. For most performers, those final minutes were spent alone, or close to it, running through material one more time, adjusting a jacket, taking the kind of slow breaths that don't really calm anyone down, but give the body something to do besides shake. It wasn't a space designed for conversation. People who worked in television understood this instinctively. The unwritten rule of a studio hallway in the minutes before a broadcast was to leave performers to whatever process they needed, however small or strange that process looked from the outside. Cedric the Entertainer understood that rule better than almost anyone. By this point in his career, he had been through more televised performances, more studio hallways, more countdowns than he could easily count. He had stood exactly where Katt Williams was standing, more times in more studios than he could probably name individually anymore, each one blurring into a kind of shared memory of cold hallways and countdowns and closed doors. He knew what those final minutes felt like from the inside, the specific texture of that kind of waiting, the way time seemed to move differently once a countdown started, the way a hallway could feel simultaneously too quiet and too loud, the way a person's own heartbeat could seem to compete with the stage manager's voice for which one was counting down faster. He had built a career on warmth, on the ability to make rooms feel smaller and friendlier than they actually were, and that instinct didn't switch off just because he wasn't the one about to walk out under the lights. If anything, standing in a hallway like that one, not performing himself, gave him a kind of vantage point, the ability to notice things that someone consumed by their own nerves might not notice about themselves. He also understood something else, something that mattered more in this specific moment than almost anything else he could have offered. He understood what it meant to be the person standing in that hallway, knowing that this particular broadcast carried more weight than most, knowing that the next several minutes could be talked about for years or forgotten by morning, with very little control over which of those outcomes would happen. He recognized, too, the particular kind of loneliness that exists in that hallway. Not loneliness in the sense of being unwanted, but the loneliness of a moment that no one else can fully share, no matter how many people happen to be standing nearby. What Cedric the Entertainer did in those final minutes wasn't dramatic. He didn't deliver a speech. He didn't offer notes on material, or talk through what the audience might respond to, or any of the things that might be expected from an experienced performer offering guidance to someone younger. What he did was simpler, and in its simplicity carried more weight than almost anything more elaborate could have. He walked over, not hurried, not formal, the kind of movement that didn't draw attention from anyone else in the hallway, and stood near Katt Williams for a moment before saying anything at all. That pause mattered. It wasn't an awkward pause, and it wasn't filled with the usual small talk that might happen between two people standing near each other. It was simply a moment of presence. Two people standing in a cold hallway, one of them about to walk through a door that mattered enormously, the other simply there, without needing to be. Then he said a few words, quiet, direct, the kind of thing said once and not repeated. According to those who have spoken about this kind of moment over the years, it wasn't advice about the performance itself. It wasn't about material or pacing or anything that could be rehearsed or adjusted in the time remaining. It was something closer to an acknowledgement, a recognition of what the moment was, of what it meant to be standing where Katt Williams was standing, of the simple fact that nerves in a moment like this weren't a weakness to be hidden, but something every performer who had ever stood in a hallway like this one had felt, including the person saying it. There was a steadiness to how it was said, not rehearsed, not performed, just present. The kind of thing one person says to another when they recognize completely what the other person is about to go through, because they've been through it themselves more times than they can count, and they know exactly how much it can help just to hear from someone who has been there that it's survivable. There was no urgency in it, even with the countdown ticking down behind the door. If anything, the lack of urgency was part of what made it land, a reminder in a space built entirely around schedules and seconds that some things didn't need to be rushed. And then the countdown reached its final numbers. The soundproofed door opened, and Katt Williams walked toward the light. What happened on stage that night became, in its own way, part of the story people would tell about that broadcast. A strong performance, well received, the kind of appearance that did exactly what appearances like this were supposed to do for a career at that stage. The material landed, the timing held. Whatever nerves had existed in that hallway didn't show up under the lights, not in any way the audience at home could have detected. But for Katt Williams, what happened on stage wasn't the part of that night that stayed with him most. It was the hallway. It was the few words said quietly, without any expectation of being remembered, by someone who understood exactly what those final minutes felt like, and chose to spend them, briefly, making sure another performer didn't have to feel them entirely alone. In the years that followed, as both men's careers continued, Cedric the Entertainer's presence on television and in film growing into something audiences recognized instantly, Katt Williams's voice becoming one of the most distinct in stand-up comedy, neither of them built that backstage moment into anything larger than it was. It wasn't a story either of them told often, if at all. It didn't need to be. Its value wasn't in being told. Its value was in having happened, in exactly the way it happened, at exactly the moment it was needed. What that moment revealed about Cedric the Entertainer wasn't really about generosity in the abstract sense. It was about the specific kind of attention that comes from having stood in the same hallway himself more times than he could count and remembering what it felt like. He didn't need to say anything that night. No one would have thought less of him for staying quiet, for giving Katt Williams the space that performers are usually given in those final minutes. But he recognized something in that hallway, the particular weight of that specific broadcast, the particular pressure of that specific night, and he chose to acknowledge it, briefly, honestly, before stepping back and letting the moment belong to the person who had to walk through that door. What it revealed about Katt Williams was something quieter, not about the performance itself, which spoke for itself, but about what it meant to him that someone had noticed. Performers carry a great deal alone, by necessity. The work happens in front of audiences, but the preparation, the nerves, the weight of what a single night might mean, that happens in hallways, in silence, usually without witnesses. To have that acknowledged, even briefly, even without elaboration, by someone who had been there before, was its own kind of support. Not support that changed what happened on stage, but support that changed how it felt to walk toward it. Looking back at that night now, what stands out isn't the broadcast itself, even though the broadcast was, by any measure, a success. What stands out is the hallway, the cold air, the stage manager's countdown, the closed door with light leaking around its edges, and two performers standing near each other in the final minutes before one of them had to walk through it. One of them had been through this before, many times. The other was about to go through it in a way that mattered more than almost anything he had done up to that point. Neither needed to say much. A few words were enough. Not because the words themselves were extraordinary, but because of who said them, and when, and why. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the broadcast, not the performance, not anything that aired that night, but a quiet hallway, a countdown, and a few words passed between two performers who understood, without needing to explain it, exactly what the other was carrying.